Hello, everybody, and welcome. This meeting will be held in accordance with Executive Order N-2920, issued by California Governor Gavin Newsom on March 17th, 2020, the Ralph M. Brown Act, California Government Code, Section 54950, ET sequence, and the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act. The meeting will be open to the public. Seating capacity will be limited to the first 30 people on the first-come, first-served basis. Compliance with all health and safety guidelines, including COVID-19 screening, temperature checks, face coverings, and physical distancing measures will be required for in-person attendance. Meeting information is on the posted agenda. Remote public comment is also available for the City Council meeting by emailing the City Clerk at cityclerk@ciseries.ca.us by 5 p.m. the day of the meeting. Include the agenda item number or public comment period in the subject line of the email. The clerk may read written comments into the record if specifically requested to do so at the beginning of your email. Your written comment will be distributed to the City Council and kept on file as part of the official record of the council meeting. And welcome everybody to the special meeting, City Council Budget Workshop. Today, Wednesday, May 13th, 2021. And I call to order. May we have the roll call?
Councilmember Rhino. Here. Councilmember Silvera.
Here.
Vice Mayor Condit.
Here.
And Mayor Lopez.
Here. Now I'm going to move on to the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay. Moving on to citizens communication. While the City Council welcomes and encourages participation in City Council meetings, adopted rules allow no more than 5 minutes. Resolution number 2007-106. California law prohibits the City Council from taking action on any matter which is not posted on the agenda unless it is determined to be an emergency by the City Council. Citizens are entitled to address the City Council on items described in the agenda for the special meeting. We will first open up public comment for those present in the chambers, which there are none. Now we will open up comments on Zoom, if there's any.
No, Mayor. No hands are
Okay.
raised.
For those participating on Zoom, the city clerk will call your name in order to request for any request to receive. When it is time for you to speak, the city clerk will unmute your microphone. So if there's no one who wants to speak, the public comment period is now closed. Today, we're having a discussion on items preliminary draft budget fiscal year 2021-2022 presentation by Mr. Westbrook.
Thank you, Mayor Lopez, council members. Let me get the view here. So here today to have our first budget workshop for the 2021-22 preliminary budget. This is a little bit more informal in nature. So as we go through the presentation, if the council has questions, just please stop me and we can answer them as we go along. The budget presentation, I get to do a little bit of the easy part, which is present this at the workshop to you this evening. The hard work has been done already by the department heads and primarily the finance division. They've spent many weeks and many hours putting the budget together, making sure that the numbers are right. And so I want to thank Letitia and her team for all the support that I get and getting to where we are this evening with presenting you the draft budget. So like I said, I have a PowerPoint. You can stop us at any time to ask questions. And then certainly when we get to the end, we'll be asking to get some direction on some key items from the council.
Okay. We're still on Zoom.
So we're on Zoom, but we don't have the screen. Stop sharing. There's no signal port. It has to be something on your end.
But we are on Zoom. They can hear us? They can hear us?
Yeah, it doesn't appear we lost the Zoom feed. Okay, it looks like we're back.
Sorry about that, everyone. We had a technical problem. We are back online. Mr. Westbrook?
Thank you. Sorry about that, everybody attending over Zoom. We had a technical challenge, but wanted to go over the agenda this evening that we'll be covering in the slides. Going to do a quick overview of the current year's fiscal budget. We'll also review the draft revenues for the next year's budget, the 21-22 budget, in addition to the expenditures for next year, the department reviews, which is really kind of a high level, and then we'll discuss the next steps. So this is a slide that depicts the current year's budget. So at the top, the 5.39 million, that was the beginning budget balance. So the city council adopted the budget on September 14th of 2020. We had a reserve balance of 5.39 million. This budget year, we're including projected revenues at 23.3 million. I'll talk a little bit later on about some of the losses that we had seen relative to COVID and some insertion of some of the American Rescue Plan funds that shored up that revenue number of 23.3 million. Also, the projected expenses, 21.7 million. Really, we saw a significant savings in our expenditures over the last year relative to salary savings from frozen and or vacant positions. And so essentially what we're projecting is to have a fund balance at the end of this fiscal year of $6.9 million. Now that number may go up just a little bit. The reason that I say that is as we get closer to the end of the fiscal year, there may be some additional savings from some of the departments, the general fund departments specifically not expending all of their budget. So that number may creep up just a little bit more. But I do think we're in pretty good shape. So some of the fiscal year 2021, we did experience a shortfall in our budget. We're a little bit below, but we'll be making up some of those in the ARP funds. Specifically, one of the big things that we saw a tremendous shortfall in was our business license tax. So typically we generate about $1.3 million in business license revenue. It's projected that this year we would lose about 500,000, and some of that is probably from closed businesses, et cetera. So we are using some of the ARP funds to shore that up. The projected expenses were slightly below the budget that was adopted in September of 2020, and primarily because of salary savings. So the final draft revenues and expenses, the pre-audit we'll know those in September and October of this year, but we do expect to add to our fund balance, our general fund reserves, from, like I mentioned, those vacant and frozen positions.
Can I ask a question?
Okay.
So on the first line, you have shortfall will be made with ARP funds. Those are not the funds we have received yet?
Those are not the funds that we have received yet. We anticipate that we'll get those by mid-June.
Okay. But we don't have those funds yet. I want to verify that we're anticipating the funds. We don't know what we can spend the funds on yet, correct?
We're confident that the shortfall relative to the reduction in revenues related to COVID is an exact use of the ARP funds. So we know that we'll be able to spend those funds in this existing year budget.
Absolutely guaranteed.
Absolute guaranteed.
Thank you.
All right, moving on. So this is the slide that has been prepared that shows some of those losses during the COVID pandemic. The yellow line is the total. As I mentioned, kind of the top line there, you can see the business license tax. We're expecting a shortfall of about 583,000. The other things are rentals of the community center, rentals of our sports fields, the sports fees. So the total of that, which we've included in the revenues for this year's budget, was $1.4 million. The good news is just this week, the federal government released, the Treasury Department rather, released its guidance for the spending of those ARP funds. None of those have been included here. Other than this amount, this is the only portion of the ARP funds that have been included in this year's budget. So we haven't planned for any of the other revenues at this point because we just got the guidance. So the draft fiscal year 2021, big picture view, unknowns related to the use of the American Rescue Plan funds. Again, when I wrote this slide, we didn't have that guidance from the federal government, which we do now. It appears that there is going to be some flexibility in how we can use those funds in the coming years. The ARP funds, as I mentioned, are supposed to come in 2 different waves. We expect to get our first installment and our amount around a little over $9 million. We're expected to get that in June sometime, and then the following June, we'll receive the second half of that money.
Is this the money that has to go to the feds? I mean, it goes from the feds to the state,
That is correct. It goes to the state, and then it comes from the state to us.
and you still think we're going to get it in June?
Yes, because on May 10th, the federal government released the guidance to all the entitlement cities. Entitlement city is anything over a population of 50,000, and they can now request directly from the federal government to access their ARP funds.
Right, but we're not included in that. We have to go to the state of California.
State of California, that is
And
correct.
they have not released when they will actually release that money to the cities.
They are required by the ARP law to do it within 30 days after receipt.
Right, thank you.
Okay, so our revenues for 2021 are projected to be a little higher than the current year. The expenditure forecast does show an increase. There will be an increase related to salaries, but that is unknown because negotiations are ongoing. So the budget that's been presented to you just carries the existing salaries from the current year to next year with no increase. There are some additional positions that are being requested. Also, there are retirement costs and health insurance costs that will be increased. And then one of the things that was a little bit of a surprise to us is that our workman's comp and public liability insurance increased a little over $600,000 this year. We believe the workman's comp was really related to COVID for the number of claims that were made. So last year, our public liability and workman's comp insurance was around 1.8 million, and this year it's going to be around 2.5 million. So our budget process starts way back in February with the creation of our internal service funds. So those are the funds, that's our IT department with all of the computer equipment, et cetera. It's also our fleet for the maintenance of the vehicles and purchases of new vehicles, in addition to the building maintenance. After that, we get the fixed cost. So we know all of our charges relative to telephone, gas, electric, water, sewer. Then the departments begin to create their own budgets. The finance department takes all of those budgets and compiles them together. That was the big binder that was delivered to each council member. And then we had reviews with the city manager. That city manager review for all those departments were in April. The first draft of our budget on April 23rd. And the general fund alone showed a $2.5 million deficit in the general fund. We made some corrections to revenue projections in addition to making some reductions in the expenditures. So the current preliminary draft budget is roughly balanced using 1.5 million of the reserves, which are carried over savings from the current year. So I mentioned a bit ago that we're projecting about at least a $1.56 million savings in the existing budget from salary savings, looking to kind of use that in next year's budget. And then, as I mentioned, that the proposed budget in front of you, other than that $1.4 million that we know for without a doubt that we can store up some of the revenues in this year's budget, doesn't include the additional funds that may be available to us through the American Rescue Plan. So we'll go through some of the revenues for the next year. So this slide and chart is changes in revenue. So the green line is really the expenditures, and the gold colored line is the revenue. So if you can see the second to the last column, if you can see my cursor here, my little hand, we're projecting that the expenditures will be less than the revenue for the current year. Again, that's the salary savings. Next year, we're showing that the expenditures exceed the revenues. We're suggesting to use some of the general fund reserves, that savings that we have in this budget year, to balance next year's budget.
But we truly don't have I mean, I know it's called a balanced budget, but we're still not spending within our means. We're still spending more than we're bringing in, which I think I've been saying ever since I've been on this council, that we need to learn to keep our expenses equal to or less than our revenue, because as in our own personal lives, can we run our personal lives that way? Can we keep spending more than we're bringing in? I mean, thank goodness we have a revenue. I mean, we have a reserve, but you can't keep taking money from your reserve. You have to learn to live within your means. And I've been saying that for almost 7 years.
And so that last column, as I mentioned, other than some of the revenue coming in this year from the ARP, this column doesn't yet reflect the balance of those funds that may come in and how those may improve our position in the budget. They are one-time fees, however. So this graph, what this is depicting, you can see the revenue is the gold line at the end here. The green box and the green line, that really kind of gives the council and the public an idea of the revenue that comes in. How much is that spent on salaries and benefits? And that's really the people, the employees that work for us. And so you can see kind of how that impacts. The blue line is the kind of the capital and the operating costs, which is a little bit lower than that. So this just gives a representation of the revenue comes in, how much we spend of it on our employees. The largest revenue source for the city is our sales tax revenue. Generally, it falls about 28% of our general fund. The sales tax rate for Ceres is 8.375%. The state of California receives 6% of that. The county transportation funds, 0.25%. The library tax is 0.125%. The city's general fund receives 1%. Our Measure H, which is the public safety tax, is 0.5%. And then Measure L is our local transportation fund, receives another 0.5%. So just going through some of our revenue sources, the column on the right, the far right is the draft budget's sales tax projection. So in the actual numbers of last year's budget, we received a little over $7 million in sales tax revenue to the city of Ceres. We expect that this year we'll be pretty much on target with that, with about another $7 million in sales tax revenue. We are projecting that next year we will receive around $7.8 million in sales tax revenue. Property tax, a little bit different, but we do get a fair amount. We're projecting almost $2.4 million in property tax. This one's a little bit different. The sales tax is pretty immediate, so increases and decreases are seen more frequently. The property tax is really going to be based upon the assessment of homes and value this year. We'll see the property tax next year. So as long as values are high, we will see an increase. If you look back in the actuals from the 04, 05 timeframe, you can see it kind of goes up and then it dips down. That was part of the recession that we saw in 2009 and 10, where those prices went down, and then they've been on the steadily, the increase in the property tax revenue has been on the increase since then. So we're projecting around $2.4 million in next year's budget related to property tax. Motor vehicle lieu fee, and this is the vehicle license fee. There was a swap for property tax in 2004. So now we get a permanent rate of 0.65% to offset the loss in property tax. That amount looks like last year we received just under $4 million. We're projected to receive right around $4 million in this current year. And then next year's budget allocates $4.2 million to our budget. As the council is aware, in 2017, the city started processing development agreements for specific type of cannabis-related industries within the city. You can see back in 2017 when those started, the revenues from that was about $830,000. As those development agreements really took effect, and there's really three primarily. There's one manufacturing and two dispensaries. You can see in the 18-19 timeframe, the revenue was around 2.2 million. And then it has steadily gone down from there as those agreements have been altered. The draft budget, the 21-22 budget, you can see on the far right, that's $1.38 million in revenue. That's going to be a pretty constant number, and that's just the public benefit fee component of a development agreement. Case manufacturing is in year one of a 5-year agreement. Patient care first, Case's journey have just re-upped for 10-year commitments. And so we're expecting to see some pretty constant revenue from the development agreements moving forward. As I've mentioned in the past, one of the things that changed in the 2018-19 timeframe is the state of California allowed recreational marijuana. And so what happened as a result of that is that some of our existing dispensaries, the two, have a sales tax component that we never expected. So we generate a couple $100,000 a year in sales tax revenue in addition to the development agreements and the fund. So that sales tax revenue goes into Measure H, and it goes into the sales tax component. Other sources of general fund revenue in the future, we use Muni Services to give us kind of a forecast. They're really good about kind of the sales tax revenue giving us that. Future growth, we haven't seen a lot of residential growth in the city for the past 4 or 5 years. We have processed a couple of tentative maps that are in various phases where we could see some future residential growth. Actually, the Planning Commission is considering a tentative map for the Whitmore Ranch specific plan at their meeting on Monday night. We're also going to see some future growth in commercial and industrial. We do have 2 pretty large industrial tracks, one off of Service Road and then one off Whitmore Avenue. We have been seeing some infill in there. We're hoping that maybe we can attract some businesses that not only bring the job, but maybe bring some sales tax component to our city. But the thing that's really exciting is we know that the construction of the Walmart is taking place. It's likely that they'll be complete with that project later this year. We're also seeing a bunch of interest from the commercial properties around that Walmart. I would expect over the next 3 to 4 year period that there's going to be a tremendous development, commercial development in that area, which will bring future property tax and sales tax revenue. As soon as Walmart vacates their existing building, staff will be working hard to get that re-tenanted as quickly as possible, hopefully with another sales tax user. I have mentioned to the council that it looks like there's somebody interested in redeveloping the Kmart site. So all of those things together are kind of showing us in a positive, if things remain constant, a positive future sales tax and property tax growth. One of the things that we don't know is anything regarding the future pandemic or any possible recession related to future closures, et cetera. I wanted to talk about some of the expenditures for the coming year. So this is a pretty important sheet. It really shows the kind of where we're at, kind of in a real good summary. So you can see the yellow column, that's the projected budget that we're discussing this evening. So as you look to the column just to the left, you can see the 5.3 million. That was the start of the reserves when the budget was adopted in September of 2020. You can see that our revenues were about $23.3 million. Our expenditures were about $21.7 million. And again, much of that was holding positions being frozen for a portion of the year, the entire year. So what happens is you have the $1.5 million towards the bottom of that column, next on the left, and you add that to the reserves, and it showed that the reserves were conservatively estimating at about 32% as we close out this current fiscal year. So that 6.9 million at the bottom runs to the 6.9 million at the top, and that's our reserve budget. So you can see some of the revenues that we're projecting, $22 million in revenues. That's your sales tax, your property tax, your triple flip. The second line, the 683,000, that's community facilities district fees. We have the revenue from the DAs for the dispensaries and case manufacturing, which is the 1.38 million. And then the $152,000 that comes from Measure H, and that's for payment of our fire apparatus. So as we move below the 25 million we're anticipating for revenues next year, we run into the salaries and the cost of all the expenditures, retirement cost, general retirement costs for public safety, and these are the general fund costs. And then you can see the expenditures are about 26.6 million. As I mentioned, staff is proposing to utilize that kind of saving from this year's budget, kind of balance next year's budget, which would leave us with a reserve of 5.4 million and around a 20% reserve. As I mentioned, to date, just because of the late nature of getting the guide from the federal government, we haven't even considered any use of the American Rescue Plan funds in this budget, other than $1.4 million that we knew we could use.
Can I ask questions on
Yes.
that? So if we look at 2020, 21 proposed, our revenues were up from the year previous, even though we were in the pandemic. They were 21,54,786 over 20,698. Okay, I'm just
Yep.
I'm just verifying that because I thought things were really bad, and I was surprised to see our revenues were up.
So it's interesting that the property tax, the triple flip, and the sales tax were pretty constant. We saw losses in other sources that make up our general fund. The business license tax was a really big one, and that was by itself $500,000. And the ARP lets us go back, I think, 2 years to the previous full year and kind of do an assessment of where that number was and carry it across. So that's how we were able to make up some of the losses.
And then on that same line for 2020, 2021 proposed, CARES Act funding, the 2.1 million, we do have that or we don't?
We utilized all of that funding.
Okay,
Yeah, the CARES Act funding that was received had to be utilized prior to December 31st of 2020. With guidance that they gave us in August, we were able to utilize that for salaries for first responders. So we utilized all funds in that manner.
and then if I go to the yellow column, salaries, 11 million. Does that include all the frozen and new positions?
It does.
Okay. And then if I go down to other expenditures and transfer out, so we're up, it looks like $1 million in expenditure.
Yes.
What are those expenditures that would make up that difference? I mean, $1 million's a lot.
Yeah,
And that's not salaries.
it's not salary, so it's operating cost, it's capital expenses. One of the big ones was the increase to our public liability insurance and our work comp.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Any other questions? Moving on. So Measure H, as I mentioned, Measure H is another significant contribution to our police and fire departments. It funds police officers, firefighters. There's some one-time expenditures. As I mentioned, we have a new fleet of fire apparatus that was purchased or that there's a repayment to that loan through Measure H. We also purchased tools and equipment. There's also some body-worn cameras and some IntelliSight cameras that we talked to the council about during the goal-setting session that we're looking at. There is a projected slight increase in revenues for this current fiscal year or the next fiscal year. So this sheet is similar, but this is just Measure H. Doesn't have any general fund at all. You can see that we're projecting, if you look at the yellow column again, we're projecting revenues in the sales of that half-cent sales tax over the next coming year to bring in about $4.3 million in revenue that will be split between the police and fire department. The expenditures that the police and fire department gave us through the budget process was about $4.2 million. 2.4 of that going to the police department and 1.8 of that going to the fire department. So the split's about 50, I think it's around 55% to the police and 45% in this year to the fire department. So the budget binder that was provided to you had a number of sheets. I know it's very detailed. It starts out with kind of the revenue projections. Then it goes into the fund summaries and details in addition to the revenue detail, followed that by the expenditures by each of the departments. So it talks about the number of positions each department has. It talks about what of those costs are personnel cost versus capital cost. By a large majority, our budget is made up of people, the salaries and the benefits for the employees that we have working for us. As I mentioned, the internal service funds, we have a number of them. Equipment replacement for fleet, our IT department. We also have the building maintenance, the internal service funds, is where we see that increase. As I mentioned, there was the $2.5 million we're budgeting this year for our workman's comp liability insurance. Workman's comp went up about $300,000 and public liability went up around $315,000. So I'm going to kind of go through just at a really high level of each of the departments. As I mentioned, if you have questions along the way about a specific department, just go ahead and stop us and we'll address those. So police department is made up of Department 9, which is your non-sworn, the 10 police department, 11, which is our part of a JPA for our animal control services, and then 13 is the code enforcement. So Department 9 is the non-sworn personnel. Those cost internal service funds for IT and for insurance. Currently, we have 11 dispatch positions. The council may be aware that we provide dispatch services for the city of Newman. So we have a contract that we have to have 2 dispatchers for that contract. So currently, there are 11 positions available. The risk factors for our non-sworn personnel, there's overtime. We have seen some staff turnover, and when we do get qualified applicants making it through the interview process and the background check, et cetera, there's a little bit of a lengthy training period. And dispatch is something that we rely on, obviously. They're providing services to our police that are out on the streets. The police department, there include Department 10. There's 52 sworn police officers. The admin staff is the chief, the captain, 3 lieutenants, and 1 administrative sergeant. On patrol, we have 24 officers, and we have 6 sergeants for a total of 30. Detectives, we have 5 investigators and 1 detective sergeant. Our special unit in traffic has 5 officers, led by 1 sergeant. And currently, we have school resource officers. We have 4 of them. The school resource officers are funded by the Ceres Unified School District under a contract. It's a 3-year contract. We're in year 1. The beauty of the SRO contract with the school district is when school is closed during the summertime, we have those officers available to assist us with vacations, et cetera. The risk factors for our police department is just maintaining staffing levels. There has been staff turnover. It's sometimes challenged to find replacement for those. There's always IT overtime costs. And then the one thing that we can't control, unfortunately, are injuries. When we have injuries, generally somebody out for an extended period of time on medical leave, we have to backfill those positions. As I mentioned, the police department has the animal control. So the city of Ceres since 2007 has been part of the Stanislaus Animal Services Agency, SASA. Their building is out on Crow's Landing Road by the sheriff's department. So we've applied their budget for the next year. Our portion of the budget is $593,000. That provides the canvassing, the sheltering of the animals that come from Ceres into the shelter. One of the things that we pay on an annual cost, we pay about $44,000 per year. That's our portion of the actual building that was constructed out there. And that payoff amount today is around $700,000. Code Enforcement, Department 13, there's 3 positions. There's 1 currently vacant. You'll probably see new positions and vacant sprinkled out throughout my PowerPoint. I do have a summary of those later on, so we'll talk about those specifically as we move through the department. One of the things that we're considering putting in this budget, so today we have 2 code enforcement officers and 1 secretary position. The secretary position is frozen. One of the things that considering asking the council is to change one of the code enforcement officers to a senior code enforcement officer to provide a little more guidance and be the lead worker within the division. As we get to Department 14 and 15, this is your Ceres Fire Department. Department 14 only has 1 position. It's the secretary for the fire department. Department 15 is the fire department, where there are 33 full-time positions that are in this year's, in this proposed budget, 1 being the chief. There are 4 battalion chiefs. We are requesting in the budget to add 1 new battalion chief, which would be an administrative battalion chief. There are 10 captains, with 1 of those being in our fire investigative unit. There are 9 engineers and 9 firefighters. The risk factors for the fire department are overtime cost, staff turnover, and injury. We've prepared a proposed budget, even though we've been discussing potential regionalization. We've prepared a budget that that allows for regionalization. If regionalization for some reason didn't move forward right away, we have salaries and benefits for our firefighters in next year's budget. Publicworks is one of the most demanding and challenging and thorough budgets of any of the departments. There are a number of them, and we'll kind of go through them over the course of the next 10 or 15 minutes. So Department 18 is our Public Works Administration. That's Jeremy and his crew. This budget is including a new Public Works Deputy Director, would be included in this budget. Department 20 is our fleet department. Again, that's all of our service to our vehicles. That's purchase of new vehicles, the repairs. One of the questions that we'll be asking the council is to reclassify an existing position, which is a fleet mechanic, to a senior fleet mechanic. In the Public Works, we also have our sewer service. Our sewer department is an enterprise fund, and there's no general fund impact to our sewer service. Our streets department, primarily funded through the gas tax funds that come through the state of California. They provide street maintenance and traffic signal maintenance for the city. Department 35 is our water service. It's also an enterprise fund. There's no general fund impact. The big lift for the water division is our continued participation in the surface water plant that has been ongoing. The request here is to include some new positions, a water supervisor, a senior water distribution operator, and a water distribution operator. Department 36 is our water conservation. It's an enterprise fund. It was created in 2015. And does not have any impact to our general fund. Our Parks Department is Department 40. Right now, there is 1 part-time maintenance worker that is a position that was frozen in last year's budget. This department behind the police and fire is the largest general fund department with a budget number of around 2.5 million. We'll be requesting in this budget to add 2 parks maintenance workers. This department was the most impacted by the recession back in 2009 and really hasn't gotten back to the staffing levels that we had seen before the crash in 2009. They're responsible for the street tree grid and prune system that they go around kind of on a 5-year timeline and prune trees within the city. Some of the risk factors for our parks department is vandalism. People steal our sprinklers. They do certain things at our park we have to replace. They've had thin staffing for a while, and then there's just an increase in demand of services. So as the council knows, we opened Eastgate Park this year, and we'll be opening Red Bluff Regional Park shortly. Department 41 is our facilities services division. So they're the ones that maintain all our buildings. They do have a custodian position that is frozen. They're primarily an internal service fund. What we see risk factors for this division is vandalism and then capital equipment replacement. Some of the pressures that we've seen for a while now in our public works department is Fund 292. This is our landscape and lighting district. A number of subdivisions that have been built since primarily 1997. They annex into the city's landscape and lighting district. However, the fees that pay for maintenance of some of our roadways and our landscaped areas hasn't been increased since 1987. And so really to kind of make this whole, the city would have to consider doing a Prop 218 process to raise the rates as one option, or to reduce services as another. The other big ticket item that the Public Works Department has been working on for some time, as the council's aware, is our new 3-can system is required to be implemented in 2022. We'll be bringing a code amendment shortly to the council to talk about the storage location of those cans. And then the other continued thing with the Public Works Department, specifically the Water Division, is our continued kind of addressing the TCP in some of our water wells. We've come a long way, but there's still more work to do. Department 45 is our downtown revitalization area board. There's no general fund impact. We'll be presenting, the staff will be presenting the annual budget to the Planning Commission, who sits as a CDRAB board at their meeting on May 17th. Department 58 is Series Redevelopment Agency, which is just the wind down. There are costs in here for the city manager, the finance director, and the city clerk. One of the things that we've heard from the council is looking to reestablish a full-time redevelopment and economic development manager. So we've included that in this budget. The cost for that is not a general fund impact. It's paid through the wind down proceeds of the Series Redevelopment Agency and the Stanislaus Series Redevelopment Commission.
But how much money do we have left in the wind down?
Letitia, can you look that up for me while I move on?
Okay, I just want to verify the question.
Sorry?
You want to know how much is left in the wind down? Okay, I'll look that up.
Okay, because if we're looking at adding a full-time economic development manager and we ran out of those funds, come from the general fund, correct? Or would it be spread across everything?
It'd be spread across.
Okay, but we don't know how much money yet we have left.
I think we get around $220,000 a year for the administration of the wind down, which pays the salary of the which would pay the salary of the redevelopment economic development manager.
But how long does the wind down last?
I believe it's another 10 years. I think it's still 2040 or 2030 rather.
2030?
Mhm.
All right, thank you.
Department 55 is the Recreation Division. There is one frozen position Some of the challenges that they have are minimum wage increases. They have budgeted for some additional funds for some community events. The risk factors in the recreation division are increased demands for services. Sometimes we get requests for free activities. There's a lot of staff turnover because they hire a lot of temporary staff, especially in the summertime, to run day camps and aquatic programs. So there's always hiring of those temporary staff. And then the recreation division was kind of hit by the pandemic with the closures of our building and some of our recreation activities. As we look to emerge from that, it's going to be really important to get that position, that full-time position filled so that we can start with the programming for the next year. Department 66 is our HR department and risk management. There is a frozen position. The allocation that pays for the funding of the city's HR department, 50% of that is allocated to the general fund, and then 25% to each, the water and sewer. Some of the risk factors, which nobody could anticipate, were COVID-19 reporting requirements. They have challenges with the ongoing hiring and onboarding process, a lot of workman's comp claims and public liability claims and new investigations. So they were always busy. The IT department, again, is an internal service fund. Their risk factors, they're fully staffed, but their risk factors are equipment failure, upgrading your computer equipment, and then rapidly changing technology and threats of viruses to our computer system. General City is Department 60. There are no personnel costs. These are primarily contract services. This is our legal. This is our contribution to STANCOG, League of California Cities, our contribution to LAFCO and the Westport Fire District, which was part of the West Landing specific plan. One of the things that we've included in this budget, and the council can tell us to leave it in or remove it. There was a request by Brandy Meyer earlier this year about reconnecting to the Tuolumne River Regional Park. And so we've added a $20,000 allocation to that. But the council can decide if they want to include that in the budget or not.
A question. We already said that we were not going to include that in the budget in our city council meeting. If we go back and look, we already addressed that issue and said we were not going to include that this year.
We'll remove it then. Some of the risk factors for the general city, increased legal cost. And then I mentioned earlier on that we had seen a pretty significant increase in our workman's comp and our public liability insurance. City council and city manager. City council is paid for primarily their budget. It's 50% to the general fund, 25% each to sewer and water. The city manager, my personnel costs are split between the general fund, water, sewer, the Series Redevelopment Agency, and Stanislaus Series Redevelopment Commission. City clerk, personnel costs are split amongst a number of funds. This one has the deputy city clerk position that was frozen in the early 2020 at the goal setting session. The council at the time directed us to include this deputy city clerk position. But when the budget was finally adopted in September, that position was frozen. Risk factors this year are a special election. In addition, we'll be updating the council districts after the U.S. Census information is published. And then there's just been a vast increase in public records requests. And so we had 25 more public records requests this year than we did the previous year. And those numbers just keep going up. And so those take a lot of time to track. And so potentially filling this position will give some relief to the city clerk to give those duties to somebody else. Community development consists of Department 57. Currently, there's a vacant part-time position. The funds for that came through some construction of homes on the west side of town. For each home that was built, they paid a little bit of money into a fund. Hopefully, if the director of community development position is hired, then we would include that, include that position, or they could hire that position to work in the housing division part-time. Today, I do duties when needed. Department 17 is our building division. Majority of the expense here is the contract we have with Stanislaus County. Stanislaus County, since 1997, has provided plan check and inspections for us, which has done a really good job. Some of the risk factors for that department are increase or decrease in building activity. As I mentioned, I think that we're going to be on the uptick of the commercial development activity and industrial over the next couple of years, potentially including some new residential construction. There's also a project that's included there, upgrading our Acela software program so that we can accept building permit, review them, and issue them all online without anybody coming to submit paper. The planning division is Department 75. Some of the costs are split between the general fund, the water, and the sewer. The director of community development position was frozen in last year's budget, remains vacant. Some of the risk factors here are increase in planning activities, both in the short term and the long range planning. One of the upcoming tasks that the city has, we have funding for, is an update to our public facility fee nexus study. When those fees are, we pay, or new development pays residential, commercial, and industrial for the development within our community, kind of for their impact to our roads, water, sewer, et cetera. The finance division does have one frozen position. They're kind of split equally between the general fund, water, and sewer. They continue to implement new accounting software. We do have a deputy finance director position. That's the one that has remained vacant. One of the risk factors here is delinquent accounts related to the COVID pandemic and the inability to for the city to shut utility customers off. Generally, in the past, when we had the ability to do that, we would get people to pay their past due balances. But since the start of the pandemic, we have been unable to do so. We believe that legislation is going to expire next month, the end of next month, if the governor does not extend it. Department 19 is our engineering division. They're spread over multiple accounts and have very little impact to the city's general fund. One of the considerations here is we have a position of an engineering tech 1, 2, or senior. We'd like to change that and reclassify it to an assistant/associate engineer. Department 95 is also held with the engineering division. That's our capital improvement program. The Planning Commission will consider the capital improvement project list at their meeting on May 17th. So just going through, kind of following up, wrapping this up a little bit, the draft general fund expenditures is 26.6 million. The personnel cost of that, like I mentioned, most of it is made up of people, is 71%, or around $19 million. When you add Measure H to the general fund, that total is around $30.8 million. Our public safety department, which include the police, the fire, code enforcement, and our animal control, with the Measure H and the general fund, is around 79%. So I mentioned as we went through that there would be a summary of some of the new positions. That list is included here. So I mentioned the redevelopment economic development manager, the battalion chief, which is an administrative position, the new public works deputy director, which is an existing position in the budget as a public works analyst. It would be unfunded, and we would create this new deputy director position, in addition to a water supervisor, a senior water distribution operator, and 2 park maintenance workers. And as I mentioned, all of those positions have been included in the proposed 21-22 budget. Just going further into expenditures, as I mentioned, the vacant and frozen positions in the current budget year accounted for nearly $1.7 million in salary savings. So staff is recommending that we hire the frozen positions that have been included, in addition to the new positions that have been requested, kind of requesting to carry over that 1.56 million into the next budget and utilize that salary savings to balance next year's budget. Again, because of the late nature of the guidance coming out from the federal government, we haven't included all of the American Rescue Plan funds that we could potentially use in this budget. So this is kind of more of the worst case scenario. So just to kind of go back through the frozen positions, again, these are the ones that were included in the budget that was adopted in September of 2020. Those positions that were frozen that we would like to hire: the Director of Community Development, the Deputy City Clerk, the Deputy Finance Director, the HR Analyst, the Recreation Supervisor, the Code Enforcement Secretary, the Part-Time Parks Maintenance Worker, and the Custodian. And as I mentioned, in addition to all those new positions that were included, these frozen positions have already been included in that budget. What we don't know is potential increased costs there may be relative to negotiation process, which is currently happening. So that kind of wraps up my presentation. So here, looking for council direction on the revenue assumptions, the expenditure direction. Depending upon how the council wishes to proceed, we have targeted a June 14th for the adoption of this budget. But that's up to the council. If not on the 14th, we could look to adopt that budget on June 28th. And so a couple of things that I handed out to the council earlier today. One, there was a sheet that included all of the positions. So it shows the adopted, the proposed positions in our budget. There's 210. Last year's budget showed 203 official positions. Currently, as of last week, even though there's 203 positions in that budget, we only really have 183 full-time employees today because of a number of vacancies throughout the organization, in addition to some of those frozen positions. The second thing that I did was kind of tried to summarize on the larger sheet. It kind of identifies all of those positions that were frozen in last year's budget, in addition to the new ones that are requested in this year's budget. Some of the assumptions that are included on that sheet, we just assumed for purposes of a salary that people hired into those positions would start at step C, which is the midpoint of the range. And we also assumed that they would select the family medical coverage for their health insurance. And so that you can see if all of the positions of the council said to move forward with each one of those positions, which I'm hoping you will, we would have a total cost of around $2.2 million in salaries and benefits. The general fund impact of those would be about $1.2 million. And I think with that, I'd be happy to attempt to answer any questions that the council may have at the time.
Well, I'm going to be really conservative, which I like to think I am anyway. And I think before I could look at hiring new positions, maybe even the frozen positions, I think we need to take care of the current employees we have. We know we have negotiations coming up. We know that we have had a few lean years where we've really not been able to compensate them the way we should have. And I think this is the perfect time that we should take care of them, see what our negotiations are going to be before we spend $2.2 million, especially for the new positions. I can recognize of the frozen positions, probably the one that would be really important would be the Director of Community Development, because we are going to see, I believe, a lot of development coming in once Walmart is finished. And we currently only have the senior planner, and the city manager is trying to continue his duties as the Director of Community Development, in charge of building department as well as the housing department. So I could see filling that, or potentially maybe even filling the frozen ones, but not hiring more until we see what we're going to do for our existing employees.
Just one comment on that, and I appreciate the feedback and the dialogue. As the council may be aware that when, if and when the council gives direction on some of these positions, releasing that recruitment is going to take a period of time. Most likely, even if we released all these positions today, most likely the soonest people would be starting probably be July or August or later. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind that there is somewhat of a lead time on the recruitment process for some of these positions.
Right, and I understand that, but I also understand that why do we want to spend the time and money recruiting people, having somebody say that they're going to come here, and then we go, oh, we aren't done with negotiations, or we're just going to go ahead and hire them. Why even go to that point until we know that we actually want to hire them? I just think it's a waste of staff time and money to start doing recruitments when we aren't 100% sure that we would fill those positions.
Okay, well, I personally don't feel we should continue to put everything off, and I support hiring all the frozen positions and also support all the new positions.
It's my turn. I have 3 questions. First of all, I see no new positions for police or frozen positions other than the code enforcement secretary in all of these 17 positions. That's correct? At this point in time, your staffing levels are adequate? Is that what you're saying? And I guess we would think the same thing for fire, besides a new battalion chief over administration, which is definitely needed. I understand how those guys that are working on the streets are trying to do the administrative part also.
So just to give a little history, so these frozen positions, in last year's budget, there were a number of positions that were vacant in the police department and the fire department. The council at the time wanted to move forward and hire those and leave these other ones frozen. So they did. I think we added 4 positions in the police department last year that had been vacant or frozen for whatever purpose. And then I think there was 3 in the fire department. So we were able to fill those positions over the course of the last year.
Yeah, that makes more sense because somebody coming in new would have it hard to believe that your biggest departments would need nobody new in this scenario. Out of 17 new employees are unfrozen, that none of them would be police or fire to stay to that extent. So thank you for that. That makes sense. And the other thing is, and this is just Brett Silvera's brain going, is that deputy finance director really makes $110,000 a year, and it's almost $190,000 in salary and benefits. And then basically the same question for the deputy public works director, makes $111,000 plus, and with salary and benefits, almost $200,000 a year.
Those are positions that we've had on books in the past, and that's the rate that is paid to those individuals. And that's the worst case scenario, assuming that it was filled at the step E. So assumably there's steps in each of those classifications from A, B, C, D, and E. We have to assume the worst. So that's why that amount is included.
Doesn't it say assume step C, not step E?
Sorry, assume step C, the middle point.
So because of their experience, you could start them at whatever step you want, or wherever they came from. You could start them at the bottom step, or you could start them in the middle. There's no requirements for that. So you're assuming this is a middle of the road person, and they are going to make $110,000.
And it
That's a
assumes
deputy finance director when they first start here.
And it assumes that they would select the family medical coverage, which is about
Right,
a
I understand that.
$26,000 cost. If they were a single person, then it would be far less.
The benefits, I guess the benefits are not my concern. That they are what they are. It's the salary that seems like $111,000 of salary for a deputy finance director, and also a deputy public works director. That's all I have right now. Thank you.
Well, I just want to first agree with my colleagues, Councilman Silvera. I agree with you on the salaries for both of those positions. And Councilwoman Rhino, I agree with you on the overall aspect of spending more than what's coming in. I'd like to start off on page 33, our adopted all funds expenditure summary by department. Has a total of $86 million, and I just want to make sure that that's the overall expenditure that the city's putting out.
That's everything we got. That's water, sewer, general fund, and our capital improvement program.
Thank you. I wanted to circle back on the liability insurance. There was a slide in your presentation that showed that, where Councilwoman Rhino had a question, and you related that to workers' comp, but workers' comp was included in that slide. And then you said the liability insurance was about a $315,000 cost, and I just didn't understand the jump for $1 million in that slide.
So the public liability insurance increased by specifically around $615,000. There was other expenditure costs that were included in the budget that I can't point to specifically because they're sprinkled throughout those budgets that increased that cost, the other portion of that.
400, okay. And I just want to clarify one more time, that 1.5 million that we're using to level out the budget, that's coming from our reserves, from our savings from last year?
So the current fiscal year, we're projecting around $1.5 million savings in this year's budget. And so we take that kind of at the conclusion of the budget year, June 30th, and we put it into reserves for next year. So we start with a balance of around 6.9 million. And then the request of staff is to utilize $1.5 million of that to put into the expenditure line so that it balances our budget, so that we essentially, we started the last budget year at around 5.3 million in reserves, and we would have about 5.4 million in reserves. And so just kind of keeping that reserve balance at about little over 5 million.
And then we did not include any raises for employees, correct?
At this point, we have not done that. In years past, we've been able to forecast that based upon labor contracts that we had, but because negotiations are ongoing, it doesn't show any increase for raises at this point in time.
Okay, thank you.
Looking at all this for the first time, it's pretty crazy, but it's really fascinating to see how many different places money comes from and goes out, comes from. Great job by our finance department to put all this together and try to make it as simple for us as possible. I somewhat agree with Ms. Rhino. My opinion, I say we should hire all the frozen positions immediately and wait to hire all of these new positions listed until we've got through our negotiation process with all of our bargaining units. That's where I would stand as of now.
So essentially, keep them in the budget as they have been listed, but not to move forward with hiring up them at this time.
Exactly, because we could, if CARES Act or whatever it's called this time, Act, isn't exactly what we think, we could possibly end up with salary savings in those positions listed as new here that we're going to include in the budget, but not hire them until we're finished with negotiations with our current employees. I think that, in my opinion, that kills two birds with one stone. We may have the ability to help out our current employees and then hire these frozen positions, and every one of those are obviously needed. So it could be a couple things. We could end up with a little bit of salary savings on positions and also take care of our current employees also.
City Manager, for the Director of Community Development, is there any grant funding for that position, or?
No, it's entirely made up of general fund. It's about 70% general fund, and then water sewer accounts for the rest of it. The other things for the council to consider, we talked about a couple of reclassifications. One was the suggestion that hasn't been included in the budget yet because we wanted to get direction. There'll be just a nominal increase, but the fleet mechanic taking it from a fleet mechanic to a senior fleet mechanic, that was one. And then the second one was in the engineering division, taking kind of a classification of engineering tech 1, 2, or senior and reclassifying that to an assistant or associate engineer. That would give the engineering division a little bit of flexibility on kind of finding the appropriate staffing that they need to run the department. So those are the two other things that I would need from you. Both the senior fleet mechanic is an internal service fund, so the difference generally in pay is about 5% difference. The assistant associate engineer is going to be a little bit more than that, but primarily those funds are paid through grants and or the water sewer account. It's really not a general fund impact, but those are the two classifications. Oh, and then in addition to that, if there's a desire to take one of the existing 2 code enforcement officer positions and classify that as a senior, again, that is a general fund expense. It would be about a 5% increase. So those are really the 3 positions that we were looking to reclassify that we wanted some direction on this evening as well.
So on the senior fleet mechanic, that is reclassifying. But when I look at the frozen new position list, they're also requesting another senior fleet mechanic.
No, it's an existing position that they would just reclassify.
Well, it's showing it as new.
I got it. That's probably my mistake. I believe it's an existing position that they're just going to reclassify.
Oh, they don't want another body. It's just reclassification.
It's reclassified. Is that correct, Jeremy? So I got that wrong. I apologize. So it's an existing position. They're just reclassifying.
What were those other 2 positions, city manager?
One was if we wanted to consider taking one of the 2 code enforcement officers, making it a senior code enforcement officer. And then the other one was taking a position, which is an engineering tech 1, 2, or senior, and reclassifying that to an assistant / associate engineer.
What's the additional cost on that?
I don't have that off the top of my head, but there is not a general fund impact in the engineering division position because those are paid by grants and the water and sewer funds. Gotta get on the microphone.
There's one more too. It's a water resource analyst to the administrative analyst, which is no general fund impacts. And it's a 5% increase.
So far the council agrees frozen positions, we're okay moving forward with that, and then we're negotiating what we're talking about now.
I'm okay with all those reclassifications also.
And I'm okay with 3 out of 4 of those. I really think we should have a 4-team code enforcement. So I would be for hiring additional code enforcement supervisor instead of reclassifying one of the current 3. So
a division of a code enforcement supervisor, 2 code enforcement officers, and a code enforcement secretary. Is that the 4-team member you were referring to, Vice Mayor?
Well, currently there's 3 code enforcement officers, correct?
No.
There's 2 code enforcement officers and 1 secretary.
So we're just reclassifying one of the 2.
Correct. So there would still just be 3 people within the division.
But you would still,
Yeah,
you would still only have 2 code enforcement officers. But if we did that, then are we going to eliminate the code enforcement supervisor? I mean, I don't know if you all know it, but we don't have a code enforcement supervisor. That was being done by Sergeant Coley. And so after he left, then one of the code enforcement officers named, I guess, an interim code enforcement supervisor over one other person, which you have a supervisor over one other person. So if you're only going to have 2 supervisors, you shouldn't have one of them be, I mean, if you're only going to have 2 code enforcement officers, you shouldn't have one being a supervisor, but I could see a lead worker. But if we do that, then we need to eliminate that job classification of code enforcement supervisor.
And I think that can be easily done. I think that, the suggestion that we're staff is making tonight is take one of those two officers and make them the senior code enforcement officer. And so with the council kind of saying hire that frozen position, your code enforcement unit would have 3 full-time employees, 2 officers, and 1 secretary to do the administrative function.
Well, and I would suggest hiring an additional code enforcement person.
As a new position.
Yes.
Okay.
So I think the only one that was ready to hire the new positions was the mayor. Would you want to add an officer to the new, and then when we come back and talk about hiring those, then we can revisit that? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think a new code enforcement officer should be included in the budget. That's what I'm saying.
Do you want to hire all the new positions at the same time as frozen?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm willing to go through those one by one
Okay.
and say which ones I don't want and which ones I do.
When we get to the point that we've got
Yeah.
negotiations and we know what kind of money we're actually going to have from the Fed.
Exactly.
So my next question would be, if we're going to reclassify one of those code enforcement officers, is it that they both get to go through it, or is it just one is automatically named the lead worker?
We have to determine that, what the process is going to be.
I was going to ask Chief Collins, you supervise code enforcement correctly through the police department. What you're feeling on as supervisors, is it necessary? Is that something that we really need to do, to your honest opinion? I believe so. That's my opinion. But they work under you.
My honest opinion is, with the amount of officers that we have, a lead or a senior code enforcement officer would be sufficient, as he would get direction from the captain of the police department. If it gets any bigger than that, then there would need to be a direct supervisor, so to be the in-between. And I'm comfortable with a senior code enforcement officer doing the day-to-day stuff.
Thank you. I agree. Also, when we get to hiring the new positions after negotiations, if that's the road we're going down, I'll support looking at it at that point, whether we can add another code enforcement officer to the list of new positions.
That was what Vice Mayor.
So today, we're moving forward with all the frozen positions. Everybody's okay with?
I'm okay with the frozen position.
So sounds like we're all good with hiring the frozen positions as soon as possible, going through negotiations, and then starting to look at the list of new candidates here.
Yeah, so what we'll do is these new positions, we'll make sure that they're included in the budget. We'll add 1 code enforcement officer to that list. And then I think that everyone was comfortable with the reclassifications that we had suggested.
So you're going to put all the new positions in the new budget?
The new positions are already in the current budget. They're already included in there. The only one that wouldn't be included is an additional code enforcement officer.
Well,
We just
okay,
wouldn't- we just
I
wouldn't be-
thought we're talking frozen. And then why would you put the new ones if we said we aren't ready to hire them? Why would you put them in the budget document?
Just to have them as a placeholder, they can be frozen as we get to the budget adoption. But it would be easier to at least have them included in the budget so we know what all those costs are.
Yeah, Lynn, if we don't include those in the new budget, then it would be much more difficult when we do get through negotiations to start adding those, however many at a time, into the budget. It makes much more sense to include those positions in the budget. Notice some salary savings in the budget on paper, and once we determine whether we're going to hire all or not. If we don't, we'll be in the situation we are now. We'll have some salary savings going through the next 2021 budget. Or
Okay,
2022.
I would disagree with you, because to me, if we're going to show all of the new ones, I don't want to see those in the budget. I want to see, when I'm talking negotiations, what I know I actually have money for, instead of then it's going to be skewing the amount that we really think we have available, is the way I see it.
What would happen?
Understandable.
What would happen if we didn't have those in there?
We can do it both ways. We can certainly back those out and then come with after negotiations are complete, we could come with a budget amendment into the next fiscal year, add the positions back in. I mean, that's the way that it can be done too. So we don't necessarily have to reflect them now. What it's going to do is it's going to really significantly drop what your expenditures show today because those positions will be taken out. Those new ones have already been included. So we've accounted for salary. We've accounted for benefits. And so that number, that $26.6 million of expenditures is going to drop a little bit, which is going to narrow that gap of the $1.5 million that we had shown. So,
But it's going to be a more accurate picture of what we have is the way that I'm looking at it. And again, if we're going to be going into negotiations with all of the departments, I want to know the money I have. And I don't think we even may have to wait until mid-year budget to revisit. I mean, if we get the money from Fed through, if the state will give it to us, and we do get all of our negotiations done, it may be before mid-year.
okay. So what I'm hearing, and correct me if I summarize this, and if I've missed that, please let me know. The $20,000 trip amount, we're taking that out.
Correct.
Frozen positions, we're going to move forward with recruitment processes to hire all the frozen positions. The new positions we will remove from this current budget.
Wait, hold up. That's the part where I disagree. I don't think we should remove it because what would be the worst case scenario? Just leave it in there because if we remove it, it's going to take another year.
No.
No?
So
I want to make sure.
Yeah, so Mayor Lopez, what we can do is, what Councilperson Rhino is suggesting is that putting just the budget, including the positions that we were going to hire and these new positions, backing them out of it is going to give us a more accurate cost of what our revenues and our expenditures are going to look like.
Okay.
And then after negotiation processes are complete, we can come back
We can come
after
back to
into
these.
the next fiscal year, and we could add those positions back into the budget.
When would
We'll
that
have a
be?
better understanding of what our expenditures will be at that time based upon any of negotiations that have been complete.
But when would that be?
Well, it will be when we're done with negotiations and when we see if we actually get that money from the Fed.
But that
So
could
it,
be
3 months.
2022, 3 months?
No. It could be.
I'm just trying to understand the
Yeah,
timeframe.
It could be before the end of the summer. I mean,
Okay, I just want to make
so
sure it wasn't.
it doesn't
next year.
necessarily have to, we don't have to wait a whole nother year, but we could bring that back in July and August
Okay,
and
I just wanna make
September
sure
to
that- okay,
discuss.
I understand now.
And so really what I have is we're going to move forward with the frozen positions.
Right.
It sounds like the classifications that we've suggested, the reclassifications, the council's okay with that. The new positions in the budget, including the new code enforcement officer position, will take out at this point in time.
Yes.
No, I'm still in favor of leaving them in and then recognizing those salaries and their amounts and knowing those are potential hires as we go through the negotiations. We take them out. It's a lot harder to put them back in later. I think it's behooves us to leave them in and just leave them as frozen positions as we go through negotiations.
And Councilwoman, I just want to understand your viewpoint on this. You don't want to have these in the budget and see a saving that we don't have. Is that your point here? or-
No. Because they're new positions, so how are we saving them if we haven't hired them yet? So the way I look at it is you're going to put positions in there that we haven't filled, but yet we still don't know how much we're going to spend for negotiations. So when I'm looking at the bottom dollar, I'm thinking this is the amount we have, but it's including positions that we haven't filled. So to me, that isn't, it's not as clear as if you don't have them, you can still hire them at some point, but if you want the clear picture of how much money you really have to go forward with negotiations, you wouldn't include them. Because when you're looking at your documentation to discuss negotiations, this all is going to be in there, right? So how are you going to make the decision first that I want to take care of my current employees if these new positions are in there. It makes sense to me. Apparently, I'm the only one it makes
Yeah.
sense to.
If I
Yeah,
could,
and I see what you're saying. I guess I'm just looking at it a different way. When we negotiate with our current employees, we'll have the number of what is available in the best case scenario after we hire all these people. I'm just looking at it that way, knowing that that number, frozen position number, whatever, is there. There just aren't bodies in those positions, but that will give us a clearer idea of where we would like to be with these positions and what we have for negotiations.
so if I may, I've just done a rough calculation in my head, so it's probably not as accurate as a finance director doing it. But if we took those new positions out, as suggested by Councilperson Rhino, what the effect that would have on that expenditure line is about $600,000. Just in a rough, so if we left them in, it stays what it is at 26.6 million. If we backed the new positions out, the general fund impact would be a reduction. It would take that expenditure line to about 26 million. So that's the difference.
I think that even makes it more why we should just leave it in there. Because I'm not going to say insignificant amount, but $600,000, if we leave that in there, will give us a really good idea of where we can be with negotiations and where we can be afterwards with hiring the rest of these people.
But again, you're looking at it of where we can be if we hire these positions, and I'm looking at it as, first, I want to take care of our employees, or we hire additional. So that's where I'm looking at it differently than you are.
I think we'll want to do them both. We'll take care of our employees and we'll figure out how we're going to hire these new employees. I mean, $600,000, it doesn't seem like a lot, but I think we should leave it in.
Yeah, I agree.
So leave the new positions in the budget, add the code enforcement officer, and move forward with the hiring process for the frozen positions. And then
That's how I
everybody,
understand it.
Did we talk about, did you guys say the code enforcement? You guys wanted to add, did you guys want to hire that?
The new.
With the
Okay, even including the battalion chief with the new?
and then we're good with the reclassifications that mentioned.
Wait, are we good
Absolutely.
with the reclassifications?
Yep.
Vice Mayor?
Yes, with the
Reclassification.
reclassifications.
Okay, that's the direction that I needed. Any more from the council?
That's
Oh,
it.
thanks again for making all this craziness look, make sense to us.
Thank you very much.
Having several new people here, it could have been a lot worse than this, more difficult than this. So I appreciate all of you, and I appreciate all of you department heads sitting here listening to us, knowing that we're new and not very experienced at this, and hoping that you believe that we're doing it for the right reasons, whatever we're. I know, Jeremy, this is tough for you. Most of these new positions are your, but it's the nature of the beast.
One of the things that I did fail to ask and get direction on from the council, because negotiations are ongoing, preparing this budget with the changes that were suggested today, do you want to look for adoption at your June 14th meeting, or do you want to have it at the June 28th meeting?
As soon as possible, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, the sooner the better.
Because the result of that is that we can hire the budget, and then the negotiation process can play itself out, and then we can simply do a budget amendment if we're not done by the end of the year, right? Letitia, is that a fair characterization? That we can get the budget adopted on the 14th, and then depending upon the outcome of the negotiation process, we'll just bring a budget adjustment back to the city council when it's ready.
Okay.
Makes sense.
So then we'll shoot for the adoption of the budget on June 14th.
Yes, thank you.
Is it? Okay, meeting is adjourned. Thank you.